December 21st, 1968, the countdown to one of the greatest moments in exploration began. The first manned lunar flight, Apollo 8, was scheduled to fly 230,000 miles out into space, orbit the moon 10 times, and return home. For the first time in history, humans were poised to head away from Earth and venture out to another world.
It took a lot of guts, it took a lot of nerve to do Apollo 8. It really was a gutsy mission. The biggest thing about Apollo 8 that I was impressed with was that the country let us do it. It showed the real capability of this country, the real willingness of the country to do things which were forward-reaching and took some nerve to do. It took a lot of guts.
We knew that the Russians were hell-bent to do the same thing, and by golly, we were going to get there first.
It really was a gutsy mission.
But I
the
really
biggest thing about Apollo 8 that I was impressed with was that the country let us do
everything was for the first time.
It showed
everything.
The real capability.
While everyone knew the stakes were high, few realized the full level of risk NASA was assuming on Apollo 8. Even its flight operations director privately set the chance of a safe return
Russians were hell-bent to do the same thing, and by golly, we were going to get
Across the country, Americans watched in awe as Apollo 8 set out on man's first journey to the moon.
Everything was for the...
It was all there in our emotions as they took off. It was a combination of concern for their safety and knowing that this was this great pioneering venture.
Roll pitch program. Roger. Mark, Bud 1 Charlie, Apollo 8.
It was beyond all.
While everyone knew the stakes were high, few realized the full level of the risk NASA was assuming on Apollo 8. Even its flight operations director privately set the chance of a safe return just 50 times.
We choose to go to the moon.
Across the country, Americans watched in awe as Apollo 8 set out on its first journey
We choose to go to the moon.
Everything was for the...
Do the other thing, not because they are
It was all
easy,
there in
but
our
because they are
emotions
hard.
as they took off.
Because that goal will serve to
It's a
organize the
combination
nation the
of
best
concern for their
of our
safety
energies and skills.
knowing that this
Because
was
that
this
challenge
great
is one that we're
pioneering
willing to
venture.
accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
It was
In 1962, when President John F. Kennedy committed the United States to send into the moon before the end of the decade, NASA was already struggling to catch up with its counterparts in the Soviet Union. Encouraged by our mission,
We choose to go to the moon.
the Soviets had all the more time and again to its achievements in space.
We choose to go to the moon.
First dual capsule flights,
But because they
the
are
first
hard.
woman in space,
Because that goal
the first spacewalk.
to organize the nation
In the
the
eyes of
best
the world, to the mid-1960s,
knowing that
the Soviets were the leader in space exploration.
NASA wanted to beat their That's what this program was about, to show the world that the American system and the
In 1962,
great things.
when President John F. Kennedy
That was
committed the
not
United
just
States
the public engineering goal.
to move ahead of the Russians and land on the moon, also launched the ambitious Apollo program. But by 1968, after a series of technical setbacks, the program had slipped far behind schedule. With the Soviets pushing towards a lunar flight before the end of the year, NASA managers gambled on a daring move to put the Apollo program back on track. A risky mission to orbit
And
the
we
moon.
have goal coming up on the 5 mark in the count.
At the end of the decade, NASA was already struggling to catch up with its counterparts in the Soviet Union. Encouraged by our mission,
We choose to go to the moon.
Three Americans, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders, are on the verge of making man's first journey to the moon.
9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are armed. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
time and achievements of space. First man in orbit, the first dual capsule flights, the first woman, the first spacewalk. In the eyes of the world, through the mid-1960s, the Soviets were the leader in space exploration.
NASA wanted to beat their That's what this program was about, to show the world the American system.
In 1962,
Great things.
these three brave men are the Columbuses of space of the New York Times. The first of the human species to move to embark upon the exploration of our solar system. So launched the ambitious Apollo program. But by 1968, after a series of technical setbacks, 8 minutes, Apollo 8 was traveling at a speed behind schedule 10 miles an hour. With the Soviets pushing towards a lunar flight before the end of the year above the Earth, NASA managers gambled on a daring move to put the Apollo program on track. A risky mission to orbit. The Apollo 8 former fighter pilots was commanded by Air Force was already hard-nosed to catch Warren views his mission as a battle in cold. Encouraged by missions, he was so focused on getting his crew home safely that he had fought to eliminate any risk he could, even arguing unsuccessfully against everyone on board.
We have ignition sequence start.
Flying his first space mission, Bill Anders was a meticulous engineer who had trained as a lunar landing module pilot. But on Apollo 8, his main job would be surveying the lunar landscape for future landing sites, while taking the first up-close photographs of the moon. Cast from a different race, James Lovell Jr. was Apollo 8's command module pilot and navigator. Unusually easygoing in the precision-minded role of Apollo, was mentoring the capsule's navigation and fostering critical maneuvers. The first was Apollo 8 prepared had already spent more time in space than any other human. 2 hours and 45 minutes into the flight, the crew prepared to fire their rocket again for trans-lunar injection, TLI, the step that would catapult them out of Earth orbit and on their way 230,000 miles to the moon. Since 1961, when the Soviet Union flew the first manned flight, 34 Soviets and Americans had orbited the Earth, but no one had ever headed straight out.
The astronauts had ever gone from the surface of the Earth was 850 miles on one of the Gemini flights. That is about like looking at a peach and skimming the fuzz on the surface of a peach. We're talking about a much bigger step.
All right, you're looking good. Roger.
The engine on the third stage lights up, and they can feel themselves accelerating out. And within minutes, they are farther from the Earth than anybody has ever been before. And they're going farther, and they're going faster. And on the computer readout, you can see the velocity galloping upwards.
Flight Fido, no, altitude coming up now. Looking real good. Flight booster, we have static data.
They're getting up to 25,000 miles an hour, which is what it takes to get you out of the Earth's gravitational well and onto a path for the moon.
Apollo 8 Houston, trajectory and guidance look good, over. We're predicting cutoff 2:55:58, and it looks exactly nominal here. Roger, Apollo 8, good here.
As Apollo 8 embarked upon their 6-day mission, they left behind a deeply troubled planet. Through 1968, America had suffered through one shock after another. The escalating war in Vietnam and the rise of anti-war protests at home. the assassinations of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. and presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy, race riots in the cities, and chaos at the Democratic National Convention. As troubles mounted in the outside world, NASA had been struggling for nearly 2 years with its own problems. In January 1967, before the first manned Apollo flight had even flown, a flash fire erupted in the Apollo 1 capsule, killing the crew during a routine drill. NASA immediately grounded manned flights for 18 months, as engineers furiously redesigned the Apollo capsule. The next 5 unmanned tests of the massive Saturn V rocket system, including flights that were called Apollo 4, 5, and 6, were hampered by technical problems that sent the rocket team back to the drawing board again and again. And by early 1968, it was apparent that construction of the lunar landing module was also hopelessly behind schedule. Apollo manager George Low spent several months trying to come up with some way to get the program back on track. Low knew that something drastic had to be done to preserve any realistic chance that an American would land on the moon before the end of the decade.
Low very quietly reviewed the situation and came up with this brilliant idea to take the second Apollo flight and instead of sending it into Earth orbit with a lunar lander that wasn't going to be ready, send it to the moon without a lander. Just do the part that says we're going to go from the Earth to the moon, test out the communications, the navigation, all of those things that you're going to have to do anyway later on for a landing. You don't need the lunar module for that mission.
We haven't flown humans on Saturn V. We haven't flown the redesigned capsule, but we're supposed to decide now to fly humans on the first Saturn V in that capsule to the moon.
He said, can we do a lunar flyby? Can we fly out and go around the moon and come back? Do you think that's a possible thing to do? And my first reaction to that was, no, I don't think we can do it. To get all the control center ready, to get the network ready, to get the crews trained, to get ourselves, the flight control team trained, and to be confident that we know what we're doing, I think would be a very difficult thing to do.
I thought at first it was a pretty wild idea, but the more that I thought about it, and we only had...
I said, yes, we want to give it a shot, but we have to tell you this. If we're going to go in orbit around the moon, we don't just want to fly around the moon. We're willing to try. We're willing to start working on these programs. We're willing to start shooting for that time period. All these things we got to build.
Low and Kraft had a tough time selling the plan to NASA's chief administrator, James Webb, who was still reeling from the Apollo 1 fire. Webb told his managers that their idea would put the whole at risk.
I'm sure he recognized that a failure in Apollo 8 would really be the end of the Apollo program, that the program couldn't keep moving forward if there had been a second failure.
The riskiest thing about Apollo 8 was the fact that they were not going to have the lunar lander along to serve as a lifeboat. The plan had always been that in case you have an engine problem on the command ship, that you'd have a whole other spacecraft there to get you out of trouble. You could use its engine to get home. But on Apollo 8, they were going to take that lifeboat option and throw it out the window.
If these 3 men are stranded out there and die in lunar orbit, Webb told his deputies, no one, lovers, no one, will ever look at the moon the same way again. But despite his objections, by the end of the deliberations with his staff, Webb wearily agreed to exploration of Low's plan as an alternate mission. He said it was insane, Kraft and Low were told, but he didn't do it.
The whole thing just clicked into place. It was like perhaps it had been out of focus if I had thought about it, but the Apollo 8 decision was the gate opener to the...
My husband came home and he, as best he could, said what he cared for, to absorb what he was telling me. And this is all. I haven't tested the capsule yet. December. That's what, 3 some odd months? But usually you train for a year. What? To the moon?
For 4 months, the flight crew of Apollo 8 and their ground crew trained relentlessly. Whole new mission plan and pushing to develop all the technical skills required by the new flight.
Just everything that we were doing, it compressed building the software and the computers to go to the moon. It compressed measuring the instrumentation we had to look at the spacecraft when we were going to the moon. And we convinced ourselves, okay, we're now ready to go. But we think we can do the flight control. We think we can do the computers. We're satisfied the spacecraft's going to work. So let's get ready and go.
While NASA pushed to get ready for Apollo 8, the Soviets were busy preparing for their own lunar mission. In mid-September, they sent a capsule looping around the moon, carrying turtles, mealworms, and a life-sized mannequin. Then in mid-November, Zond 6 carried another payload around the moon. Knowing that the Russians had a brief window to launch a lunar flight in early December, Americans sensed that the race to the moon was coming down to the wire. NASA's worst fears were realized when the CIA sent word in late November that a Soviet rocket capable of carrying 2 men was moving into launch position. Just a month before Apollo 8, it looked like the Soviets would outmaneuver the Americans once again.
People in our country were convinced that we would be the first to land on the moon because they were used to the fact that we were always the first. The first, the first.
What no one outside the Soviet leadership knew was that both unmanned Zond flights in the fall had problems during re-entry that would have killed a cosmonaut. In the upper reaches of the Soviet government, a heated debate was underway over whether or not to risk sending men on a December flight to the moon.
We could have done it 6 months earlier. 2 of the crews had passed all the tests and trials. Certainly it was only the indecisiveness of our chief designer at the time, Vasily Pavlovich Mishin, that caused us to fall behind in this program.
As NASA managers held their breath, the window for a Soviet launch came and went. Soviet leaders were ultimately unwilling to risk a crew without another test flight. While the Apollo 8 astronauts made final preparations for their flight at Cape Canaveral, their wives were left in Houston, caring for their families on their own.
I would say they were probably gone 6 days out of every week. We had to fend for ourselves. I mean, we didn't expect them to worry about us, and I would say that we probably kept many things of the family to ourselves. As much as I tried to hide my fears, even from myself, it was not easy on any of us, and it wasn't easy on our children, especially the older children who understood what was happening.
We'd say how proud we were, how confident we were, and then I'd go back in the house.
In other parts of our country at that time who were wives of people missing in action in Vietnam, who were wives of fighter pilots fighting in Vietnam, and that's what our role would have been had it not been this.
As the training for the new mission progressed, Frank Borman was approached by Deke Slayton about his next flight. With all the changes in the flight schedule, it now looked as if Apollo 11 would be the first attempt at a lunar landing. In the typical crew rotation, that assignment would fall to Apollo 8's backups, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and either Fred Hayes or Mike Collins. In this case, though, Slayton wanted to give Apollo 11 to Borman with his crew intact. But without consulting Lovell and Anders, Borman cut off the discussion. For the sake of his family, he told Slayton, to attend a gala dinner at the White House.
The wives were flown from Houston to the White House, and all I remember is being extremely nervous because the Hong Kong flu was going around. And I don't remember anything about what happened in the East Room. There was some operetta or show put on, and all I heard was coughing and sneezing and thinking, this crew will be sick on the flight. They shouldn't be here. At the end of that program, we said goodbye to them in a room full of people. And he gave me some tapes that were to be played if something happened to him. And I think we were very aware when we said goodbye that this could be goodbye. That were to be played if something happened to him. And I think we were
Shortly
very
after
aware
breaking
when
out
we
of
said
Earth orbit
goodbye
on
that
December
this could be
21st,
goodbye.
the Apollo 8 crew jettisoned their last booster rocket and watched in awe as the Earth receded in the capsule window.
I can see most of South America, all the way up through Central America, the Yucatan,
that were to be played
and the peninsula
if something
of Florida.
happened to him.
There is a big swirling motion just off
I think we were
Shortly
very
after
aware
breaking
when
out
we
of
said
Earth orbit
goodbye
on
that
December
this could be
21st,
goodbye.
the Apollo 8 crew jettisoned their last booster rocket and watched in awe as the Earth receded in the capsule window.
Yeah, tell the people in here, I can see most of the South, put on your raincoats, look like a storm is out there. All the way up through Central America, the Yucatan,
So much rested.
If something happened
Hopes
to
of
him.
America and the hopes of the world, perhaps, rested on the success.
Shortly after breaking out of Earth orbit on December
This could be
21st,
goodbye.
the Apollo 8 crew jettisoned their last booster rocket and watched in awe as the Earth receded in the capsule window.
Once man had been there, no man had been there, and returned safely. Everything was there. And it always rested on so much rested.
If something happened to him.
11 hours into the flight, with another 2.5 days to go before they reached the moon, Frank Borman was the first scheduled for sleep. But before he turned in, the crew had one crucial maneuver to perform, a short test of the only remaining engine, the Service Propulsion System, or SPS. At the moon, it would have to slow the command module enough to allow it to drop into lunar orbit. 11 hours into the flight, after orbiting another 2.5 days to go, the SPS would have to burn again to send the first scheduled for sleep. But before he turned in, the crew had one crucial maneuver to perform, a short test of the only remaining engine, the Service Propulsion System, or SPS. At the moon, initial readings showed that the SPS had module enough to allow it to drop into lunar orbit. 11 hours, a couple of restless hours, another toss and turn in a hammock beneath the seats, struck a burning again to send the first scheduled. Then, after taking a sleeping pill, but before he became seriously ill with vomiting and diarrhea, a short test of the only remaining engine. When doctors in Mission Control learned of Borman's condition, they immediately suspected a virus in the capsule. At the moon, initial readings showed that the SPS out of Mission Control to allow private confidence about whether to perform a couple of restless hours and the toss and turn in a hammock. Mission Control was struck and jolted by more bad news. Closer analysis of the SPS showed a slight malfunction.
We fired this engine, which was a confidence burn. It was intended to give us confidence that this engine, which we were counting on at the moon, was going to be all right. Lo and behold, the engine didn't behave properly. So we were sitting here looking at that, stuck with, oh my God, is this engine not working right? Does this mean we cannot go all the way to the moon and put the vehicle in orbit? Do we have to turn around and come back?
After 10 minutes of anxious debate, NASA engineers reported that the malfunction was likely temporary, and they believed the engine would work properly when fired again to go into lunar orbit. Without enough fuel to test the engine again, 32-year-old flight director Glyn Lunny made the call to proceed on course. When Kraft and Lowe returned from their deliberations over Borman's illness, they accepted the decision on the SPS, having made a similar call about the crew's health. By now, the commander was feeling a little better, and the other astronauts were showing no signs of infection. Though off to a rocky start, the mission would continue as planned.
Okay, we're rolling around to a good view of the Earth.
At 2 p.m. on December 22nd, the second day of the mission, networks interrupted Sunday programming for the first televised broadcast from Apollo 8.
Okay, Apollo 8, we have a good picture.
This is coming to you approximately halfway between the moon and the Earth. We've been 31 hours flight. We have about less than 40 hours left to go to the moon. You can see Bill's got his toothbrush here. He's been brushing his teeth regularly to demonstrate how things float
The
around.
broadcast was supposed to provide an unprecedented view of the entire Earth, but lens problems made that impossible.
I certainly wish we could show you the Earth. It's a beautiful, beautiful view with predominantly blue background and just huge covers of white clouds. Very, very beautiful.
Even without the Earth views, Americans were captivated as the drama of the crew's voyage began to sink in.
Happy birthday, Mother.
Behind the good-natured banter was the reality that these three men were alone 100,000 miles out in space, moving farther and farther away every minute.
So I'll be signing off here and looking forward to seeing you all again shortly. Goodbye from Apollo 8.
At 2:30 in the afternoon, Houston time, on December 23rd, the third day of the mission, the crew of Apollo 8 crossed the gravitational divide. Now, instead of pulling away from the Earth, they were being pulled toward the moon.
All right. Mode 1, 5 hours. Roll. 1.
Roger. The new attitude for the mode 1 5 hour and mode 15 minutes are...
12 and a half hours later, tension filled the air as the astronauts prepared to fire the SPS engine. If all went well, it would slow the capsule just enough to safely enter lunar orbit. The crucial maneuver would take place on the far side of the moon, out of radio contact with the Earth.
50 seconds away from time of LOS now. Our distance away from the moon, 460 nautical miles.
The moon is moving along in its orbit at thousands of miles an hour.